Modern science is built on rules, informed consent, ethical oversight, institutional accountability. But for most of the 20th century, these safeguards did not exist. Between the 1930s and the 1970s, scientific research expanded at an unprecedented pace. Advances in medicine, psychology, and military science were driven by global conflict, political fear, and competition between nations. In the United States alone, federal funding for scientific research increased more than tenfold between World War II and the early Cold War. The problem was simple. Technology advanced faster than moral regulation. There were no standardized ethics committees, no legal requirement to inform participants of risks, no obligation to stop experiments once harm became evident. Researchers operated under a guiding assumption that the pursuit of knowledge justified human cost. Many experiments were officially approved by government agencies, universities, and military institutions. They were peer-reviewed, published, and defended. The subjects, however, were rarely protected. Tonight's story is not about secret laboratories or illegal science. It is about experiments that were legal, documented, and supported by respected institutions. Because the most disturbing scientific experiments were not hidden. They were authorized. While some unethical experiments were driven by medical curiosity, others were fueled by something far more powerful: fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of enemy nations. Fear of falling behind. In the mid-20th century, scientific research became inseparable from national security. Governments began funding experiments not only to understand the human body, but to exploit the human mind. Few projects illustrate this better than MKUltra. Project MKUltra, 1953 to 1973. In April 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles approved a top-secret program known as Project MKUltra. Its objective was explicit: to investigate methods of mind control, interrogation, and psychological manipulation that could be used against perceived enemies of the United States. This decision was made during the height of the Cold War, a time when American intelligence agencies believed the Soviet Union and China were developing techniques for brainwashing prisoners of war. MKUltra was not a single experiment. It was a network of over 150 sub-projects, conducted at universities, hospitals, prisons, military facilities. Many of the institutions involved were unaware they were working for the CIA. Methods and experiments. The experiments explored extreme and poorly understood techniques, including administration of LSD and other hallucinogens, sensory deprivation, electroconvulsive therapy, hypnosis, sleep deprivation, psychological isolation. In many cases, subjects were never informed they were part of an experiment. Some were prisoners offered reduced sentences. Others were psychiatric patients. Several were ordinary civilians, including government employees. One of the most controversial substances used was LSD, which was still experimental and largely unregulated at the time. Subjects were dosed repeatedly, sometimes for weeks, while being interrogated or observed behind one-way mirrors. The goal was not treatment, it was control. The case of Frank Olson. One of the most well-documented cases connected to MKUltra is that of Frank Olson, a civilian biochemist working for the U.S. Army. In November 1953, Olson was unknowingly given LSD during a CIA retreat. In the days that followed, his mental state rapidly deteriorated. He became paranoid, confused, and emotionally unstable. 9 days later, Olson fell from the 13th floor of a hotel in New York City and died. For decades, his death was ruled a suicide. In 1975, investigations linked Olson's death directly to MKUltra. His family later received a formal apology and financial compensation from the U.S. government. No criminal charges were filed. Exposure and aftermath. In 1973, then CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of most MKUltra records. Despite this, surviving documents were uncovered during the 1975 Senate hearings, led by Senator Frank Church. The Church Committee concluded that MKUltra had caused severe psychological trauma, long-term mental illness, violations of fundamental human rights. Yet no CIA officials were prosecuted. The program was justified at the time as a necessary response to external threats. What MKUltra revealed instead was how easily scientific research can be weaponized when accountability disappears. A pattern, not an exception. MKUltra was not an anomaly. It was part of a broader pattern in which governments treated human experimentation as an acceptable tool, as long as it served strategic interests. Ethics were considered secondary. Consent was optional. Secrecy replaced responsibility. These experiments were approved not because they were safe, but because they were useful. And in that environment, the boundary between research and abuse ceased to exist. Long before ethical review boards existed, medical science operated under a dangerous assumption. That observation was more important than intervention. That belief led to some of the most disturbing human experiments ever conducted, not in secrecy but in full cooperation with government agencies and academic institutions. One of the most infamous examples took place in the United States. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study, 1932 to 1972. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service launched a long-term medical study in Macon County, Alabama, in partnership with the Tuskegee Institute. Its official purpose was to study the natural progression of untreated syphilis in black men. The study enrolled 600 participants. 399 men who had syphilis. 201 men who did not, used as a control group. The men were mostly poor sharecroppers, many of whom had never received formal medical care. They were told they were being treated for a condition known locally as bad blood, a vague term that included fatigue, anemia, and infection. Crucially, they were never informed they had syphilis. In exchange for participation, they were offered free medical exams, meals, transportation, and burial insurance. Powerful incentives in a community with limited resources. At the time the study began, there was no reliable cure. But that changed. By 1947, penicillin had become the standard and highly effective treatment for syphilis. The cure was widely available across the United States. The researchers made a deliberate decision. They would not treat the participants. Internal memos later revealed that doctors were instructed to prevent subjects from accessing penicillin elsewhere, including through military draft programs. The goal was clear: the study would continue until death. Over the next 4 decades, researchers carefully documented the physical and mental deterioration of the participants. Men went blind, suffered neurological damage, experienced organ failure, and died. The consequences extended beyond the subjects themselves. At least 40 wives were infected. 19 children were born with congenital syphilis. The study only ended in 1972, after Peter Buxton, a public health service employee, leaked details to the press. Public reaction was immediate and severe. Congressional hearings followed. The federal government issued a formal apology in 1997. The Tuskegee study fundamentally reshaped medical ethics in the United States, becoming a central case study in how institutional authority can override basic human responsibility. Other human radiation experiments, 1940s, 1960s. Tuskegee was not an isolated case. During and after World War II, hundreds of Americans were subjected to radiation experiments funded by the U.S. government. Patients in hospitals were injected with radioactive substances without their informed consent. Pregnant women, children, and terminally ill patients were often selected. In one case, patients at Vanderbilt University were given radioactive iron to study absorption rates, without being told of the risks. At the time, radiation was poorly understood, and the long-term consequences were underestimated or ignored. Many subjects later developed cancer or chronic illness. These experiments remained classified for decades. It wasn't until the 1990s that the U.S. government formally acknowledged their existence and provided limited compensation to survivors. The core ethical failure. What united these experiments was not cruelty for its own sake. It was detachment. Researchers viewed participants as data points, as variables, as bodies that could be measured over time. Consent was considered unnecessary. Suffering was reframed as observation. Responsibility was diffused across institutions. The scientists involved believed they were advancing knowledge. What they failed to consider was the cost. These experiments revealed a central danger in scientific authority. When the pursuit of information is separated from empathy, human beings become expendable. And once that line is crossed, progress no longer serves humanity, it exploits it. While experiments like Tuskegee and MKUltra exposed institutional abuse, psychology revealed something even more unsettling: how easily ordinary people can be led to harm others. Unlike medical experiments, these studies did not rely on drugs or physical manipulation. They relied on something far more powerful: authority. The Stanford Prison Experiment, 1971. In August of 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo conducted an experiment in the basement of Stanford University. 24 male college students were selected from over 70 applicants. They were screened for psychological stability and physical health. No history of violence. No criminal background. They were paid $15 per day. The experiment was designed to last 2 weeks. Participants were randomly assigned the role of guards or prisoners in a simulated prison environment. Prisoners were arrested at their homes without warning, fingerprinted, blindfolded, and placed in cells. Guards were given uniforms, sunglasses, and batons, symbols of authority. No physical violence was allowed. But within 36 hours, prisoners began showing signs of acute emotional distress. Crying, anxiety, disorientation. Guards escalated behavior rapidly. They imposed arbitrary punishments, forced prisoners to perform humiliating tasks, deprived them of sleep, and isolated individuals in solitary confinement. What shocked observers was not the cruelty itself, but how normal it became. The participants stopped seeing themselves as students. They began to fully inhabit their assigned roles. Zimbardo himself later admitted he became so absorbed in the experiment that he failed to recognize the ethical violations as they were happening. After just 6 days, the experiment was terminated. The conclusion was deeply troubling. Under certain conditions, situations can override personal morality. Given authority and structure, cruelty does not require evil intent. The Milgram obedience experiments, 1961 to 1963. A decade earlier, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted a series of experiments at Yale University that would permanently alter our understanding of obedience. The experiments were conducted in the shadow of the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi officials defended their actions by claiming they were just following orders. Milgram wanted to know, would ordinary people obey authority even if it meant harming another person? Participants were told they were assisting in a memory study. They were instructed to administer electric shocks to a learner whenever an incorrect answer was given. The shocks were fake. The learner was an actor. But the participants did not know this. With each mistake, the voltage increased from 15 volts to 450 volts, labeled danger, severe shock. As the experiment progressed, the learner screamed, begged to stop, and eventually fell silent. At multiple points, participants hesitated, expressed concern, or attempted to stop. The experimenter responded with scripted prompts. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. You have no other choice. The results were alarming. Approximately 65% of participants administered the maximum voltage, believing they were causing serious injury or death. Most participants showed visible distress, sweating, trembling, nervous laughter. Milgram concluded that the primary factor driving obedience was not aggression, but deference to authority. In other words, people were not acting out of cruelty. They were acting out of compliance. Why these experiments matter? Unlike earlier studies, these experiments were not hidden. They were conducted at elite universities. They were published in academic journals. They were considered legitimate science. And yet, they exposed something profoundly uncomfortable. That morality is not as stable as we believe. That social structure can override conscience. That under the right conditions, ordinary people can become instruments of harm. These findings force psychology to confront a difficult truth. Evil does not always come from malicious individuals. Sometimes, it comes from systems that reward obedience and suppress dissent. Experiments on those who could not refuse. Throughout the history of unethical science, one pattern repeats itself relentlessly. When consent became inconvenient, researchers turned to those who had no power to say no. Children, prisoners, the institutionalized. Groups whose voices were either ignored or deliberately silenced. The Willowbrook hepatitis experiments, 1956 to 1970. At the Willowbrook State School in New York, an institution for children with intellectual disabilities, researchers conducted a series of hepatitis experiments over more than a decade. Children were intentionally infected with hepatitis to study how the disease spread and progressed. Parents were told participation was voluntary. But admission to the overcrowded institution was often conditional on consent. Researchers argued that infection was inevitable due to poor sanitary conditions, so studying it was justified. Many children suffered severe complications. Some died. At the time, the experiments were approved and published in respected medical journals. Prison experiments and the use of incarcerated bodies. From the 1940s through the 1970s, U.S. prisons became testing grounds for pharmaceutical and chemical research. Inmates were exposed to experimental drugs, chemical agents, radiation, cosmetic and industrial compounds. In exchange, they were offered small payments or reduced sentences. At Holmesburg Prison in Pennsylvania, dermatologist Dr. Albert Kligman conducted hundreds of experiments, exposing inmates to dioxin, a highly toxic chemical later found in Agent Orange. Many prisoners later reported chronic illness, scarring, and psychological trauma. Consent forms existed. Understanding did not. The ethical reckoning? These experiments raised a disturbing question. Can consent exist in environments defined by coercion? By the late 1970s, regulations severely restricted experimentation on prisoners and children. But for decades, these populations were treated as convenient resources, not human beings. Biological and chemical tests conducted on civilian populations. During the Cold War, several governments conducted open-air biological and chemical experiments to study dispersion patterns, exposure levels, and population vulnerability. These tests were designed to simulate the spread of biological weapons in real-world environments. The populations involved were not informed. Operation Sea Spray, 1950. In September 1950, the U.S. Navy conducted an experiment known as Operation Sea Spray. A naval vessel released a cloud of bacteria, later identified as Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigii, off the coast of San Francisco, California. The release continued for several days. According to military documents, the goal was to measure how biological agents would disperse in an urban coastal environment. Following the experiment, local hospitals reported a significant increase in urinary tract infections. At least one death was later linked to the bacteria. The exposed population numbered in the hundreds of thousands. At the time, Serratia marcescens was considered harmless. Later studies identified it as an opportunistic pathogen, particularly dangerous to immunocompromised individuals. Subway and urban dispersion tests, 1950s, 1960s. Between 1962 and 1966, the U.S. Army conducted multiple dispersion tests in New York City's subway system. Light bulbs filled with bacterial simulants were smashed on subway tracks to observe airflow and particle movement through tunnels and stations. The experiments demonstrated that biological agents could spread rapidly across the city within minutes. Passengers were not informed and no consent was obtained. St. Louis zinc cadmium sulfide tests, 1953 to 1965. In St. Louis, Missouri, the U.S. Army conducted a series of aerosol dispersion tests using zinc cadmium sulfide, a fluorescent compound. The substance was released over residential areas, including public housing projects. Military records indicate that the tests were designed to simulate biological agent dispersal over urban populations. Decades later, residents reported elevated cancer rates and respiratory illnesses. The long-term health impact remains disputed due to limited epidemiological data, declassification and public disclosure. Many of these experiments remained classified until the 1970s and 1980s. Information became public through congressional hearings, Freedom of Information Act requests, declassified Department of Defense documents. In 1994, the U.S. government acknowledged that open-air tests had been conducted on civilian populations during the Cold War. Some individuals and families filed lawsuits. Most cases were dismissed due to statute limitations and lack of direct causal proof. By the late 20th century, the damage was impossible to ignore. The experiments we've explored in this video did not exist in isolation. Together, they revealed a pattern, one where authority, urgency, and fear repeatedly outweighed basic human dignity. But they also forced change. Public outrage, legal investigations, and survivor testimony pushed governments and institutions to confront an uncomfortable truth. Science, left unchecked, can become indistinguishable from abuse. The birth of modern research ethics. In response to these revelations, formal ethical frameworks began to emerge. In 1947, following the Nuremberg trials, the Nuremberg Code was established. It introduced a principle that now seems obvious, but at the time was revolutionary. Voluntary informed consent is essential. Later, in 1979, the Belmont Report was published in the United States. It defined three core principles that now govern human research: respect for persons, beneficence, justice. These principles became the foundation for institutional review boards, or IRBs, independent committees responsible for evaluating the ethical validity of scientific studies. Today, no major research institution in the United States can legally conduct human experimentation without ethical approval and documented consent. Progress, with limits, modern science is undeniably safer than it once was. But the legacy of these experiments still shapes public trust. Communities affected by past abuses, particularly minority groups, continue to express skepticism toward medical institutions. That mistrust did not appear overnight. It was learned. And even today, ethical boundaries are tested. Emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, genetic editing, neural interfaces raise familiar questions. Who benefits? Who bears the risk? And who decides where the line is drawn? History reminds us that good intentions are not enough. Why remembering matters. These experiments were not conducted by villains in isolation. They were approved, funded, and defended. Remembering them is not about condemning science. It's about understanding responsibility. Knowledge without restraint has consequences. Progress without accountability leaves victims behind. The most disturbing lesson of all is this. These experiments were legal at the time. And that means they could happen again, if we stop paying attention. If you found this video informative, disturbing, or thought-provoking, consider supporting the channel. Subscribe for more documented stories that explore the darker edges of science and history. Like the video if you believe these stories matter. And share it with someone who values truth over comfort. Because understanding the past is the only way to prevent repeating it.